It had been a long night for our family already, and we were working our way through a pretty much empty airport. It was about 10 o'clock in Minneapolis. We'd been flying home from Yellowstone National Park last summer with 3 kids, and we missed our connection flight. And so we're finally having to spend a night in a hotel in Minneapolis. And we're walking through this airport, and out of nowhere, there's this huge crowd and all this energy and excitement. There's cameras and microphones and looks like fans of some kind. And we're like, what is going on here? Well, it turns out that Gable Stevenson, who was coming home fresh off of a gold medal in the Tokyo Summer Olympics in wrestling. Now, Minneapolis isn't really his hometown, but that's where he wrestles as a college athlete at the University of Minnesota. And so all these reporters and fans were ready to welcome him back and celebrate him. And this is often the case if a successful athlete returns to their hometown, or an actor, or someone who's had a lot of success out there in the world. Oftentimes they're met with a warm reception. But it's different with a prophet. N.T. Wright puts it this way. He says, preaching is something dangerously public that emerges from something intensely private. It's one thing for a person we know and love to win a gold medal. It's another for them to lay bare the depths of the human condition. Today we have a scene where Jesus returns to his hometown of Nazareth after a season of being baptized and preaching and healing, traveling around the towns of Galilee and proclaiming to people the good news of God's kingdom and what that meant. And so here we pick it up in Mark 6 as he returns to Nazareth. Jesus left that place and came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. On the Sabbath he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astounded. They said, where does this man get all this? What is this wisdom that has been given to him? What deeds of power are being done by his hands? Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us? And they took offense at him. Then Jesus said to them, prophets are not without honor, except in their hometown and among their own kin and in their own house. And he could do no deed of power there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and cured them. And he was amazed at their unbelief. The gospel of the Lord. Praise be to you, O Christ. Now, we're not told the initial response of the people in Nazareth when Jesus enters the town. Maybe some of them were excited. Maybe some of them were a little wary and skeptical. Surely they'd heard the reports of what Jesus was doing in these other towns. But once he begins preaching, and he had just begun preaching, right? We read that on the Sabbath he began to teach in the synagogue. As soon as he begins preaching, the whispers begin. You think, what was Jesus preaching? Well, what we know is that John the Baptist and Jesus' message was not just about something God was doing out there. It was centered on the person of Jesus. If we looked at Luke, where Jesus preaches his first sermon in Luke chapter 4, he reads the scripture from Isaiah and about the good news being proclaimed and healing and comfort being brought. And he says, today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing it. In him, Jesus is the agent of the kingdom's inauguration. Klein Snodgrass says it this way. He says, Jesus was not just part of his own good news, but the key factor in what was happening. Or more poignantly, Scott McKnight says, Jesus preached Jesus. And to clarify, it's not that Jesus was talking about God bringing the kingdom and coming to deliver his people that upset most people. Most people wanted that to happen. What upset most people was that he set himself, not just as the ambassador of that kingdom, but the embodiment of that kingdom. And perhaps then it becomes a little more clear why his family and hometown were taken aback. It says they were astounded as he began preaching. And that word there, astounded, it's not a negative or positive word. It's really about being taken aback, right? Something makes you do a double take, surprises you, disorients you, runs perpendicular into your expectations, right? They're thrown off. They're thrown off of balance. here. And that's just the reality. Jesus was surprising them with what he was saying. And he's inspiring in them questions. And they ask 4 questions. And all of them are about Jesus' origin and identity. The first one is, where is this coming from? It doesn't sound to the people like the theological vernacular that they were used to. Like, we don't talk like this in these parts, is kind of the idea here. I remember when a few years ago I went on vacation and had designed the service, and at the end of the service I had placed a video clip, it was an audio clip, I guess, of an old preacher named S.M. Lockridge, and a section of a sermon that's called "That's My King." And Dr. Lockridge was a black preacher, a civil rights activist, and I'd heard this 6-minute excerpt from one of his sermons, and I thought it was great, and I thought it would be a good conclusion to the service. And I came back from vacation the next week, and multiple people independently expressed their displeasure with this clip. And perhaps the audio was a little loud, and the sanctuary probably needed to adjust it to my own preaching volume, maybe. But not only that, people's ears were attuned at that point to my preaching style, none of which quite matches up with Dr. Lockridge. It's not right or wrong that it did or didn't connect with people, but the point is that it cut against the grain of what people were used to hearing. A fiery black Baptist preacher thundering away compared to what people were used to, listening to this white Congregationalist teaching through a text. And so the people here, they're hearing something that it's just not what they hear in the synagogue. And they're thinking, where is this coming from? Imagine if that contrasting voice was from your own town. Imagine if someone comes back to your hometown and starts proclaiming a different message than anything the people around your town had heard, right? You can see how you might be thrown off balance. Then they ask, what's this wisdom he's been given? And that's an interesting phrase, that it's not his wisdom. They know it's not what he grew up with, right? It's from somewhere else. It's been given to him, but where? From where? And I think some insight into this question comes from Mark 11, where when Jesus enters Jerusalem, people are asking a similar question. They're asking, who gave you this authority? And Jesus comes back and asks them, well, what do you think about John the Baptist? Was his baptism from heaven or human origins? And that's kind of the question here. Where does this wisdom come from? Is it heavenly? Is it from God? Maybe there are some who recognize it as a gift from God. But the tone of the entire passage indicates it's kind of like a kid who comes back from college and starts talking politics or theology or whatever with his parents. And they're wondering, who have you been listening to? Who is undoing what we spent all these years teaching you? And these powerful things that come from his hand is the phrase that they use. They've heard of these miracles that Jesus has been doing. They've just heard we just heard about some of the rumors that had made their way back to his mother. Last week we talked about these, right? Some of them are saying, he's out of his mind. And some people are wondering, maybe his mighty acts are sourced in evil powers, not divine powers. So maybe they're skeptical. They've heard the reports and they're thinking, yeah. Enough of this talking, enough of this preaching. Prove you've got the substance, not just the style. Show us these rumors we've been hearing, what you're doing in all these other towns. And then finally, they say, isn't this the carpenter? Right? He's from the same stock as Mary, who was pregnant before she was married. And these other folks whom we've known since they were this big. And the sisters that married our sons and still live with us. He's a carpenter, not a rabbi, not a priest, not a scribe. And they end up, after asking these questions, working their way through this process, they end up with the conclusion, no, we know who this is. We know who this is. And so far we know emotionally that they've been thrown off. And then they were astounded, right? They were taken aback. We saw that. And then Mark lets us in on their thinking process, which is worth noticing for ourselves. What is our thinking process when we experience what psychologists call cognitive dissonance? When something throws us off balance and counters our expectations, what do we do with that? What goes on in our heads? What questions do we ask? Maybe for the people here in Mark 6 in Nazareth, maybe these are genuine questions. They genuinely want to know, like, where is this coming from? Where did he get this wisdom? Where do these powers come from? And you can totally see how the wheels are turning. And they're kind of asking, they ask all these questions, and these are all the things that are coming up for us. And then they're asking, like, what do we know? And what don't we know? Well, they don't know the origins of this wisdom. They don't know where these mighty deeds are coming from. They don't know where all of this hoopla around Jesus is coming from. But they do know this guy, they think. He's just one of us. We know where he's from. We know his family. And that's where they stop with what they do know. And how often do we do this? What we know about someone all adds up in our minds to who they are. Right? So we know this, and this about a spouse or a kid or a neighbor or a celebrity or what, right? And we fill in the blanks in that picture from what we do know to who the whole sum total of who they are. And so instead, for the people of Nazareth, instead of these questions about wisdom and powerful deeds leading to curiosity about all these things that they don't know, instead they settle for certainty about the one thing they think they do know. Because it's far easier to stick with what you know than to explore surprising mysteries that arise in your life. How often do we settle for certainty about the things we think we know rather than dive in with curiosity to the things we don't? And what does that do to our brains when we just settle for that? What does that do to our relationships when we settle for our picture of someone rather than the sum total of who they truly are? What does that do to our experience of the world and to our souls? Well, we see what it does to the people of Nazareth, because now they're not just astounded or confused. Now it says they took offense at him. Now they're offended. The word here is the origin of our word, scandalized. But its own history from the Old Testament is the idea of stumbling on something or encountering an obstacle to faith. In other places in the gospel, it's used to talk about people who with no spiritual, or whose spiritual roots wither when trials come. It's used to talk about how Peter and the disciples desert Jesus when he's arrested. In this text, the irony is that it's Jesus who is the stumbling block to their faith. And in fact, that's how Paul talks about Christ crucified in 1 Corinthians 1. The idea of a crucified Messiah ultimately creates movement away from the truth. Let's just go to 1 Corinthians 1 for just a second here. In 1 Corinthians 1, if I can get there, chapter 1, verse 18, he kind of starts this line of argument. He says, "For the message about the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved is the power of God." And so on. He says, "For Jews demand signs, and Greeks desire wisdom, but we proclaim Christ crucified, a stumbling block," there you go, there's the word, "a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles." Right? And so an encounter with the crucified Christ, with Jesus, actually turns people away from faith, from true faith. And so instead of drawing nearer to truth faith as they listen to Jesus' proclamation, they move away from it. Perhaps it's not so much that Jesus himself is the stumbling block, but it's the very internal processes that we just walked through, the internal logic that precludes God from doing the very thing that God is doing, from saving the very way that God is saving, from being the very Messiah that God is being. It's not that Jesus is the stumbling block, it's that their own frameworks and structures of thinking and processing is the stumbling block to true faith. And you wonder, what was this like for Jesus? Right? He seems to take it all in stride and, as usual, has a pithy adage for it. And he's not alone. He's not alone. He sees himself as part of a more general principle. But the way he says it just breaks your heart, doesn't it? He says, a prophet is not welcome in their hometown. Ouch. The very people who nurtured you, who know your story, who are your original assurance of belonging, right? The people you grow up with in your hometown, they're the ones who shape your idea of, oh, at least I belong here, to some extent. And now they're saying, wait, you don't belong. And then he says, a prophet is not welcome among their own kin. And we're getting closer to home. These are the people who share your blood. If anyone has cause to welcome you, it is these people. And then finally, he says, a prophet is not welcome in their own house. And now we've come literally as close to home as we can. Inside the household itself, Jesus is not welcome. As we saw in chapter 3, even Jesus' family is spinning through these questions and their own internal logic, and surely that has to hurt. The people who know you as intimately as anyone in the world can't truly see you. As we wondered last week, maybe it's because his life reflects so directly on them, or because his suffering is the hardest to take in, but regardless, it's a painful reality for Jesus. And I think there's a greater principle of our faith as well. Because the way Jesus says this, it reminds me of God's call to Abraham. When God calls Abraham, he says, go, and he tells Abraham to leave his country and his kindred and his father's house. Does that sound familiar? Your land, your hometown, your kindred, and your father's house. To follow God's call, or later on he says, sacrifice your son, kind of general, Isaac, more personal, the one you love, right to the heart. Again, this call of faithfulness is cutting deeper and deeper and deeper into the center of his comfort, his attachments, his very soul. It is a crisis of faith. It is not everyone's call to go a totally different direction from our families, but there does come a point in each of our lives where we come to this reality of where do we belong? What is our call? Where our parents' faith or our church's faith or our culture's faith must become our own. And we have to make that decision and ask, what do we really believe? What am I really called to? But it is especially true for the prophet, the one who lays bare what is most deeply true and real, the one whose entire life mission is to expose reality when most people's entire life mission is to avoid or deny reality. There must somehow, for the prophet, be deeper roots than anything human beings can provide. There must be a deep internalization of that heavenly voice that says, this is my beloved Son. I delight in him. To know that he belongs to God and with God and in God. And in this case, the rejection that Jesus experiences in his hometown and his kindred and his household, it doesn't divert Jesus from his sense of call and mission, but it does amaze him. And it does interrupt the partnership inherent in God's mission and Jesus' mission, the partnership of divine grace, healing, liberation, renewal, and human faith. Here, there's divine grace, but there's no human faith. And so Jesus leaves, and lives out his mission elsewhere. Now, there are points to take away from Jesus' experience in all of this. Some of us are called on a large scale or in isolated moments to be the prophet. And it can be very uncomfortable, especially with people we know and love and who know and love us. There are questions of our belonging and our sense of call and how we speak truth in love, even when it's not welcomed or recognized by people that we deeply care about. But I want to continue this morning imagining ourselves into this story as the disciples and in his family and in the people of Nazareth, the people who knew him or thought they did. Because ultimately our question in this series and in Mark's gospel is, who do you say I am? And in this story, we realize that we can know just enough about Jesus to stumble, to fall away, to miss out. We can be just certain enough or comfortable enough in our own faith and spirituality and internal logical processes to crowd out those times when Jesus surprises us or counters our expectations. It seems to me like it's all about that space between being astounded and being offended. That space between being taken aback and turning away. What we do in here when the Jesus we meet in the Gospels, or even along our faith journeys, doesn't fit what we've been told or taught or assumed. What do we do when the Jesus we thought was on our side, suddenly we hear his voice coming from over there or with them? And that's not theoretical for me. I loved seminary. I met many wonderful people and was taught the Bible and ministry extensively, and I am incredibly grateful for that. But there has also been an ethos in places I've worshiped and studied that is, concerned that you stick to the appropriate sources for hearing God's voice. People who believe certain proper things, particular ways of reading the Bible, etc. And I've had, over the years then, to be astounded a few times and process, wait, is this God's voice in this place I was told that God couldn't speak? Speaking through this person I told doesn't know God? Wait a second. Is this gay or non-binary pastor who goes by they, them, and their pronouns really a model of integrity and the love a pastor should have for their congregation? Is this brash pastor who just criticized pretty much everything I believe really going to become the iron sharpening iron kind of friend and ministry partner that I really need? Is this black man who has rejected the Christianity I learned really opening my eyes and heart to care about injustice and oppression? Is this layperson in my church whose Bible knowledge pales in comparison to mine really revealing the face of God to me in ways I could only pray to in a sermon? Is this guy who dramatically disagrees with the sermon I preached really modeling for me how to have respectful dialogue? And at this point in my life, as I've shifted, it goes the other way too. Are these conservative guys I'm doing push-ups with at 5:30 in the morning in some parking lot really making me rethink how the church works? In each of these moments, I have to ask those questions in my head. Wait, do I stick with what I expected or knew? Or do I explore these new possibilities? Do I try to play it safe and be faithful to what I've been taught? Or do I take a risk and trust that God's grace and wisdom will guide me in unfamiliar territory? Do I live in the fear that I have to dot my I's and cross my theological T's for God to accept me into heaven? Or do I believe the gospel is about opening up new vistas in my practice of love? Do I assume my mission is to protect God from those other people? Or do I join Christ at the table with sinners and see what kinds of redemption pops up there? Now, I'm sharing in a general way, some of the moments of me being astounded that I recognize looking back. I'm sure there have been many more times and points where I have stepped back and been astounded and processed and turned away. By God's grace, I'll have plenty more chances in the future, plenty more moments when Jesus will astound me, and I'll probably respond somewhere between taking offense and taking up faith. Okay, one caveat here. What I'm not saying here is that anything different, any different view of Jesus, any opposing viewpoint, anything that's different from what you know or expect is automatically right and good and healthy and exactly what you should believe. That's not it at all. What we're talking about here is how do we allow Jesus to astound us and surprise us and do new things? What do we do when we have that feeling of being astounded or taken aback or off balance? What do we do when that happens? And when it comes to faith, I want to offer that the way we discern these things is by spending time with Jesus. Not so much the Jesus we know or we think we know, or all the facts about Jesus we know, but rather by spending time with the true and deeper Jesus that is underneath and beyond our knowledge. And this may sound strange to some of you, but others of you know exactly what I mean. Because our beliefs about Jesus are not Jesus. To discern when it is truly Jesus disrupting us and leading us on a new path, it requires a robust process of spiritual practice, which we really should get more into sometime, and we will. But it's not just with our own internal logic. We can't just run these new experiences of Jesus through the internal processes that we already have. Otherwise, we're going to end up like the people of Nazareth, just sticking with what we know about him, as opposed to letting Jesus open himself up to us in new ways. The way we discern is with the Gospels here, and with a community of believers, but also Christians coming from different times and places and traditions. And by taking deep, long pauses in the God whose still small voice often contrasts with the winds and fires and earthquakes of the many preachers and talking heads that tell us all the things we should believe all the time. This process of faith is not being cast to and fro by every new and trendy idea about Jesus. It's about opening ourselves up to God's beloved Son, the one who brings God delight, and finding ourselves in that love and delight, and from there sent on mission. So it's not being content with my own ideas about Jesus, nor is it jumping on board with other people's ideas about Jesus. It's about tuning deeply into Jesus himself, the Messiah, the Son of God. Of course, none of us want to be like the people of Nazareth here, ultimately scandalized and turning away from Jesus. The problem for us is that the alternative requires us to take a leap of faith from what we think we know and are certain about into curiosity and learning and openness to the surprising works of God. And that's a very uncomfortable leap. Faith is an uncomfortable way of living oftentimes. And so who do we say that Jesus is? Is he that guy we know, or that mystery we want to dive into no matter what the cost? As we're doing in our worship time on Sunday, I'm going to invite you to reflect on a couple questions as we close here. The first is to maybe find someone else or just think about for yourself a time when your faith shifted. What was it in that moment that helped you to see Jesus in a new way? What made you open to moving from astounded to receptive rather than astounded to offended? And the second question is this: what is the situation right now where you're feeling astounded? Right? So disoriented, confused, not sure what to do with it. Where does this come from? Is this a heavenly thing? Is this a human thing? Is this good? Is this bad? What is a situation like that right now? And how can you sit in that situation this week and look for Jesus? What would it look like for you to rest in that before you say, nope, this is what I know about it and this is what it's good or bad? Before you do that, how can you sit in it with Jesus this week and ask God, what are you doing in this? What's your viewpoint on this? What new thing might you be teaching me through this? So take some time and reflect. In your quiet time, you can read the Gospel of Mark through and notice the things about Jesus that maybe make you uncomfortable or confuse you. Sit with those. And we're going to close now with a prayer by Thomas Merton, which may get at where some of us are in this moment. My Lord God, I have no idea where I am going. I do not see the road ahead of me. I cannot know for certain where it will end. Nor do I really know myself. And the fact that I think that I am following your will does not mean that I am actually doing so. But I believe that the desire to please you does in fact please you. And I hope I have that desire in all that I am doing. I hope that I will never do anything apart from that desire. And I know that if I do this, you will lead me by the right road, though I may know nothing about it. Therefore, will I trust you always. Though I may seem to be lost in the shadow of death, I will not fear, for you are ever with me, and you will never leave me to face my perils alone. Amen. Go in peace.